Feeding our babies is supposed to come naturally. We see images of cooing babies and smiling moms and doting grandmas and expect that to be us. We don't see all the struggle that goes into every decision that seems so high stakes at the time. We don't expect all the leaking, the engorgement, the deciding to take a break. We don't expect all the judgment, whether we breastfeed or bottle feed or pump or don't. Or maybe we do expect all those things and it comes smooth sailing. But what I have encountered as a doula, a childbirth educator, and a lactation professional is that when I tell people what I do, the stories flow out naturally. And I love hearing them. I hope you do too. I'm your host, Lo. Welcome to the Milk Making Minutes. I started the Milk Making Minutes because I'm passionate about supporting breastfeeding people. But more importantly, I knew that hearing real people tell real stories would benefit both the storytellers and the listeners. I had this idea for 3 years before I launched. I asked so many people how I should begin, and Anchor came up repeatedly as the easiest way to launch a podcast. And I have not been disappointed. If you are passionate about a topic and have wanted to start a podcast, you can use Anchor to record and distribute your podcast. It's easy to use. You can use the editing tools right from the platform. You can distribute your podcast episodes seamlessly to listening platforms like Spotify and Apple Podcasts right from Anchor. And the best part is, it's free. And the tech support has been great too. Go to anchor.fm or download the app right to your phone to get started on your great podcast idea. Hi, Danielle.
Hi.
Welcome to the Milk Making Minutes. I'm so glad you're here.
Me too. Thank you so much.
Yeah, so I'd like to have you start just by introducing yourself and your family and telling us, just about your family before we get started.
Sure. Yeah. So my name's Danielle Griggs, and I live in Central Mass with my husband and 3 girls. Ella is 8, Audrey is 4, and Gloria turns 2 this week.
Oh, awesome. Happy birthday to your little one. That's fun. Okay, so that means you had your latest at the start of the pandemic.
I did.
Oh,
Yeah. Yeah.
wow.
She was
Okay.
born about 2 weeks before lockdown started.
Wow. So I'm so
Yeah.
interested to hear about the differences in feeding your babies, if there were any, from before lockdown to after.
Yeah.
So before we get into actually, what breastfeeding was like for all 3 of your kids, I would love to know what your exposure to breastfeeding was.
Oh, almost
Before you had
nothing.
kids. Okay. Yeah. Tell me about that.
I had no idea about any breastfeeding anything. It was not something most people in my family did. My mom certainly didn't. And I was I think I was on the early end of our friend group having kids. So certainly with my first, I hadn't seen my friends breastfeeding either.
Mm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, what led you to thinking about breastfeeding then?
I'm like a fairly crunchy person in general, and especially around birth stuff. So I had my first in a birth center, and we work with midwives, and so it just kind of fell into that whole category. And I guess I just sort of thought it was the natural thing to do, so that's what I was going to try to do.
Mm.
Um, so I guess it was kind of my default choice.
Mm-hmm.
Hmm.
So did you turn towards any resources or anything as you were thinking about, did you think about breastfeeding before you were pregnant, or it was once you became pregnant then you started
It was
thinking about it?
definitely, yeah, I think once I became pregnant. And,
Mm-hmm.
I meant to take a class. I think I was signed up for a class about breastfeeding when I was pregnant, but I wound up not being able to go. And so
Mm.
I had I was completely unprepared.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, great. So then you signed up for a class. Did you have any other goals or expectations while you were pregnant related to feeding?
Not really. Not really. I guess I just sort of thought you have the baby and you nurse and it just sort of happens. I was completely clueless.
And so because you said there was no one around you who had really breastfed, when were you telling people that was your plan? What was the feedback there? Were you
Yeah,
getting
yeah, I definitely told people that was my plan. I mean, my mother-in-law, she breastfed her 3 children, so she knew more about it and was, like, very supportive. My family was certainly supportive, but just had no idea what any of that was about, really.
Mhm.
Mhm.
Okay. All right. So then we know that breastfeeding and birth are so interrelated. So if you could just give us, I know you have 3 children.
Yeah.
So let's start just with the first, go all the way through, and then we'll go through and start with the second. So what was
Okay.
it like? Like, what was your birth experience like with the first, especially, thinking about how that might have impacted your breastfeeding relationship and outcomes?
Yeah. Yeah, so she was my, easiest birth, actually. She
Oh,
was
wow.
spontaneous labor on her due date. She was born on her due
No way.
date.
Wow.
um, which I know is not super common. And like as I said, we were at North Shore Birth Center at the time, so we were in the little cottage across the street or across the parking lot from the hospital.
Mm,
So I labored at home a lot, and then I was probably pretty advanced in labor by the time we went to the birth cottage, and then um, I wound up getting transferred to the hospital at 10 centimeters because my water finally broke and there was some meconium. So I got a stretcher ride across the parking lot with
oh,
my
wow.
entire extended family in tow because they were
Oh
all
my
there
goodness.
in the lobby to support us. We wound up like riding in an elevator heading into the hospital together, which was funny.
Oh my gosh.
And yeah, and she was born like 40 minutes later, no issues. She was really the most straightforward one, really, and she
Mm,
did she did great.
mhm. And so
And
then, um, directly, so no medication or anything with that one?
no,
Okay,
nope.
like pain medication.
Yeah,
And then,
no.
after her birth, immediate skin to skin.
We did a little bit of skin to skin, but I think she got wrapped up and I think handed to me. So she wasn't naked for very long. We didn't get a ton of skin to skin right at the beginning.
Mhm. Yeah.
Mhm.
And then, what was feeding like initially? What were those first experiences like?
Well, so we had a really tough time. I think, again, I did not understand that there was like work to be done about breastfeeding, right? Like
Mm,
I thought you just sort of do it and it just kind of happens, and maybe that's the case for some people. That's not been my experience at all. And
mhm,
so she had a hard time latching. I My milk took a while to come in. She was starting to lose some weight in a way that the hospital was worried about. So they gave me a nipple shield and that the SNS, the supplemental
mhm,
feeding system, the tubey thing where you
mm,
you put the formula in at the top and it kind of comes down. And so that's how I was feeding her when I left the hospital. And I didn't really have a plan for how to get off of that. So I wound up
mm,
coming back in to work with the hospital lactation consultants. A couple of times I got mastitis pretty early, and my supply never really felt like it was established. I never felt like a letdown or anything like that. So I think I kind of missed the boat right at the beginning, and I never caught back up.
mm,
So I pumped for, a few weeks, and I nursed when we could, but she wound up being mostly on formula.
mhm,
Um, which was I was pretty disappointed about it. I guess I didn't realize how attached I was to the idea of nursing until I like tried it and had it not go super well.
mhm.
Um,
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So when you said, you left the hospital, you had the SNS system, which a lot of people might be familiar with. You described it really well. It's a tube you attach at the nipple, so that baby is nursing simultaneously while also sucking other forms of milk, sometimes formula, sometimes pumped breast milk or donor milk through a tube
Mhm.
at the same time. Um, so you were using the SNS. So when you got released from the hospital, were those appointments to come back and see the IBCLC? Was it an IBCLC or some other?
It wasn't. It was I want to say that it was, people from their nursing staff who were,
Mhm.
s you know,
Like
designated as lactation
certified lactation
consultants. Yeah.
counselors or something. Okay. Yeah. So, did you already have those appointments established to come back? Did they, or did you have to call and say, I need help.
Yeah, I
Can
had
I
to
come back
call
in?"
and say
Okay.
I needed some help.
Yeah. And
Yeah,
were
and
you
then
in
and also that coincided with me getting mastitis. That was probably like a week after we went home because it was right at
Mm.
Thanksgiving. My She was a Thanksgiving baby. And I remember I didn't feel great on Thanksgiving, and the next day I
Oh,
woke up and I felt
no.
pretty gross, and I had mastitis, and that's when I wound up going back in.
Yeah. And so you went back in. Were you diagnosed at the hospital by mastitis or by someone else?
At the hospital.
Mhm. And what did they do for your mastitis?
I got antibiotics,
Mhm.
and that was kind of it. There was
Mhm.
never really any. I mean, knowing what I know now, I feel like there probably should have been, but there was never any conversation about why did this happen this
Mhm.
early.
Mhm.
Pretty good indicator there was probably something else going on, right? But
Right.
it really didn't come up, so I was pretty clueless.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah. And so did you feel like you were able to, well, were you in any pain or anything? Was she latching? Tell me about that.
She was latching, but it wasn't painful. Like, in
Mhm.
retrospect, I don't think it was, painful, but I think I didn't know what was supposed to hurt and what wasn't. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I feel like, "Oh, this is uncomfortable, but it seems like it probably should be uncomfortable." So maybe that was
Mhm.
fine, you know?
Mhm. Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah, and so you said she had lost weight in the hospital, which what brought on the supplementation, and then did she continue to lose weight once you got home, or you were already on supplementation at
I
that
was
point,
already
so she was.
supplementing, so
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, and tell me about, the support of the pediatrician and your own care providers once you got home. Did you feel like they were providing you any information, or you just felt kind of out there in the
Yeah,
world with the baby?
they really didn't. I didn't know enough to ask, I think, at
Mm,
the time, but
mm,
it definitely
mhm,
wasn't offered much. And I didn't see the midwives again until the 6-week
mhm,
checkup. So,
mm,
by that point we were nursing like very few and far between
mm,
sessions because she had, pretty much transitioned to the bottle and primarily formula because even if I pumped, I really didn't get very much. Um,
mhm. And where did you get your pump? From the hospital?
I no, I got that from my insurance company.
Okay, so before you gave birth, your provider probably sent a prescription somewhere?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Um, okay, and then did anyone at the hospital provide any counseling on pumping and how?
Definitely not.
Okay, so you
Yeah.
were just
I was flying blind.
flying blind, and you said you didn't realize how attached you felt to breastfeeding until it wasn't really happening. Can you talk a
Yeah.
little bit more about that?
Yeah, yeah, well, I think, I had it in my head that we were gonna give it a try, right? And then when
Mhm,
it didn't go well, I definitely I felt pretty let down about that, and then also got, like, really, really determined to be more prepared for my second. I
mhm,
also had, again, like, more friends had kids shortly after,
yeah,
I had my oldest, Ella. So,
mhm,
like, I saw them nursing, and I have a friend who, worked at a birth center until pretty recently, and so she was full of good information, and she had a baby shortly after I had Ella, so I was able to see, how she handled everything, and then I felt like I knew better what I should be looking for the next time
mhm,
around.
mhm. Yeah, so what was that like to feel, because I feel like we can't win no matter what we do.
I know.
We can't win, right?
Yeah.
And you described yourself as fairly crunchy.
Yep.
So what was that like for you when, you had this goal? I think when people describe themselves as fairly crunchy, a lot of people in their circles tend to have the same goals around birth and breastfeeding. Um, and so did you get any were people in your circles pretty supportive about your formula supplementation and your struggle with breastfeeding? How did
Yes.
that turn out?
Yeah,
Okay.
definitely. I mean, I think it was interesting to talk to my mother-in-law because she, again, she nursed her 3 children until they were toddlers, and I think she never had any issues, and so I think she wasn't even, like, really aware that it could be that difficult to nurse, right? So she,
Mhm.
she would sort of suggest like, "Oh, put her back on the breast," and it just was not
Mhm.
happening. So no one really had any
Mhm.
negative feedback about supplementing with formula or even just then switching to
Mhm.
formula. So that was good for sure, but I think it was just really my own disappointment.
Yeah. And did people understand your own disappointment, or did they try to kind of
Yeah, I think
change your
I think it
disappointment?
was kind of a mix. I mean, I
Mhm.
think there were definitely people who were sort of like, "Well, you got a healthy baby. Just focus on the healthy baby." You know what I mean? And there's
Mhm.
something about, your own like lost experience that
Yeah.
people who haven't been through that don't necessarily understand.
Right. Yeah. Mm. And then, what were nights like for you, with a baby who you had wanted to nurse but ended up mostly bottle feeding? What was that like for you? Sleeping and
She was a pretty
eating?
good sleeper towards at the
Mhm.
beginning. She wound up being a very terrible sleeper as a toddler, but as a baby, she was actually a pretty good sleeper. So she,
Mm.
we could, I guess it was nice that we could trade off, with the bottles, and I didn't feel as tied to the house as I have with my other kids, just because, I knew I could go out to the store or something for an hour or two and should be fine at home with a bottle with my husband. So there was definitely some freedom there. And I
Mhm.
guess it also, I went back to work around 3 months. And at the time, I was in like a very high pressure position, and I had a long commute. So it was also, there was some peace of mind for sure about not having to try to fit pumping into my day and commuting with milk and stuff like that. So I guess, there's certainly a bright side to the way that
Yeah.
that worked out. Yeah.
Yeah. And by the time you did go back to work at 3 months, it's Ella, your first is Ella.
Yep.
She was fully on formula at that point.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. So for her, you did not, deal with at all needing to navigate pumping in the workplace, or
No. Nope.
okay. Okay. And was your, husband supportive throughout all the changes and the transitions and trying to figure it out? And
Oh yeah, totally. Yeah.
Mhm.
And honestly, I think he liked that he was able to feed the baby too. So when, when it didn't work out, he was happy to jump in to get more time with the baby too.
Mhm. Yeah, yeah, a bright side.
Yep.
So I would like to know, how did you know, before the transition to bottles fully happened with her, could you tell when baby was transferring milk and when baby was not
No.
transferring milk?
No,
Okay.
I had no idea. If she was
Mhm.
on my boob, I just kind of figured it was happening, but
Mhm.
now having nursed successfully, I didn't see any of the I didn't see like milk leaking out of her mouth sometimes. I didn't hear the
Mhm.
swallowing. I never felt a letdown. I never felt engorged. So I
Mhm.
I suspect that very little ever got transferred. And I
Mhm.
probably just never, the supply never came in because I don't know if the latch wasn't there or what happened, but it never
Yeah.
happened really.
It's hard to know exactly where, at what point things kind of were disordered a little bit.
Yeah.
Um, you can't go back and relook at every single moment. Yeah.
Yep.
Um, Awesome. Well, thank you so much for sharing that experience. I think so many people are going to relate to that. And they're gonna hear it, and they're gonna then say, "Oh, I felt that, and I felt that disappointment," or, "I felt that, and I felt that relief too," because you're naming the pros and the cons. You're
Yeah.
naming your disappointment, but you're also naming the things that did make it a little bit easier for you as well, having
Yep.
experienced both. And I think that's a pretty honest way to talk about it with people. So do you wanna go back then and talk about so there's a 2-year age difference between your oldest and your middle, is that right?
4-year
4.
age difference.
Okay,
Yeah,
okay,
so Ella was 4 when we had Audrey, who is now also 4.
okay, okay, so
Yeah.
you're pregnant again, you already said you decided to do things differently, so what did you do to prepare yourself differently the second time?
So I don't know if this is a wacky thing to have done, but I met with a lactation consultant in advance of having the
Mhm.
baby.
I don't think that's
Um,
wacky at all. Yeah.
I I was doing a lot of like prenatal yoga and fitness classes and stuff at a place that was supposed to kind of be like a hub for mothers. So they had somebody who was like their resident IBCLC. And so I met with me and my husband sat down with her. And I mean, it was part therapy session. I just kind of vented about how things had gone awry with my oldest and that I wanted to
Mm,
prevent that from happening. So she gave us like a bunch of info to learn about in advance. And I had done my own, learning online and books and stuff like that too, so that I could be a little more ready this time around.
yeah.
Um, and yeah, so she was super super helpful, and then it was good too because I already had a relationship with somebody, so that when I needed support afterwards, I already knew her. I was already one of her clients. I could give her a call, and it was easy. So that worked. That was very very helpful, to have talked to her in advance. And then the other thing that I guess was different about, about that baby, we had a very hard time getting pregnant with our second. We had an
Mm,
unexplained secondary infertility for whatever
mm,
reason.
mhm, mm,
And so I felt like I really wanted everything to go exactly as I dreamed it would, right?
mm,
So
mm.
um to kind of set myself up for that. This time I planned to have her at the birth cottage up in New Hampshire, which is like a standalone
Yeah.
birth center. My One of my best friends was like a receptionist there for a while. She had had her son there, so it felt really homey. And I had great relationships with the midwives there, and so that was the big plan. Go have the baby in like the most supportive environment possible. I wanted skin to skin right away. I was gonna really jump in on the nursing, and I felt like I was totally prepped and ready to go. And then, babies don't like care about that at all. So she would not come out. She was 12 days late, and I wound up having to go into a local hospital for a post-dates ultrasound just to make sure she was doing okay. And
Mhm.
I went into labor at the ultrasound, and I never
Oh.
left the hospital.
Oh, like,
So I
your water broke or what? What?
No, well, I had taken so the midwives had given me something they called magic labor potion, which
Mm,
was a concoction of all kinds of kind of gross ingredients, but just a drink to sort of see if that would kickstart things. And I
mm,
had that in the morning, and I thought that it didn't work because it had been longer than it should before.
yeah.
Um, so, we talked to the midwife who was on call, who of course was like the only midwife I hadn't met in the course of all of my appointments at the cottage, and,
Of
just
course, yeah.
classic birth story problems. But yeah, I talked to her, and she said, "Yeah, if that was going to take effect, it probably would have started already. So why don't you keep your ultrasound appointment, head in there, hopefully baby's doing good, and if, nothing happens tonight, we'll give the potion another try tomorrow morning." So that was the plan. And then of course on the way to the hospital, I started thinking, that might be contractions, I'm not sure. And sure enough it was. So I was
Mhm.
in labor on the ultrasound table. Absolutely terrifying, the like tech in training, I think.
Oh no.
And they, of course, they had, they had no records on me because I hadn't been treated there. So as far as they were concerned, I was this like random woman off the street, like in labor. So they were very nervous about me
Right.
leaving,
Right.
understandably. So they asked if we would go upstairs and check in with the maternity floor and just, make sure that everything looked okay, that everybody was comfortable with me heading out and going to the birth cottage, which was about an hour drive. And just labor progressed super quickly,
Oh
and
wow.
there was a weird problem with the phone system at the birth cottage, so the midwife wasn't able to connect with the OB who was on call. Everybody was totally freaked out that I was going to leave and like have a baby on the road somewhere. So basically we were convinced to stay put, and it turns out that it was good that we did because again, things like moved pretty quickly. So I think I had started contractions like before noon, just before noon, and I think I had Audrey around 4 o'clock. She wound up being a C-section.
Mm.
um because I'm not even really sure why. It's one of those situations where you just feel like, was this really necessary? But
Yeah.
sort of seemed like that's where things were headed, like from the second we checked in to this maternity ward, supposedly just to be monitored. It just seemed like that's how it was going to go. So it was a fairly traumatic birth,
No.
really,
Yeah.
really,
Mhm.
really difficult. And um, so I kind of had it in my head like, the birth did not go well. So I'm going to make sure that nursing goes really, really well. And
Mhm.
it totally didn't. So we did not get skin to skin at all. They basically took the baby away from me while they were, putting me back together basically. And there was a shift change while that was happening. So I was
Oh.
put in a room. I didn't see anyone for like 2 hours. It was
Oh no.
completely weird. But I did eventually get her back. And I mean, she was healthy. She was fine. I was, you know, putting her to the breast as much as humanly possible. And again, I had no real sense of like what should hurt and what shouldn't hurt.
Mm.
So I definitely was there was definitely something up. I could definitely tell that something wasn't working the way that it was supposed to because I was having like a lot of pain. And
Mm.
then actually like some bleeding from my nipples and stuff like that. So I could tell
Oh,
something wasn't
immediately, like
right.
in that first day?
What?
This was on that first day? The first
First, yeah, like first couple
wow.
of days. Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And I was, because I had the C-section, I was in the hospital longer than I had anticipated. So
Mhm.
we were there for like a few days, and I had like everybody checking the latch, and I don't know,
Mhm.
no, it looks pretty good. That looks pretty good. Seems like it's okay.
You're
But
like,
I
"But
was,
my nipples are bleeding."
I know, I'm in really rough shape here. um, so yeah, and then I wound up with postpartum preeclampsia, which they caught on the
Oh.
way out of the hospital. Like they were take it was like my last set of vitals, and they sort of realized, oh wow, your blood pressure is pretty high. So I was still able to be discharged, but it meant that I had like a lot of follow-up appointments. Like I
Yes.
think I had to go in every 2 days while they were kind of managing the blood pressure thing, which thankfully was very easily managed with medication. But
Okay.
because of that, I was constantly at the OB with with the baby, and I could sort of show everybody like, I don't think this is right. So I wound up calling my lactation consultant that I had met with before I had the baby.
Mm.
And it probably took me a little longer it than was ideal to like make that phone call, but I think I was just really distracted by the preeclampsia issue, and just really I had been totally thrown for a loop by that
Yes, of
birth
course.
disaster. So I was just like not putting things together in my head as quickly as I might have. And
And also so
um
many people were telling you, "This looks good."
looks fine, this
And
looks
they were
fine.
wearing scrubs and white coats and
Yeah.
weird thing to
Yeah,
trust
and
those
I mean,
people. Yeah,
it's like the lactation consultants at the hospital, right? So you
right.
sort of think,
Mhm.
well, if they think it looks okay, it's probably okay.
Right.
Um, but it definitely wasn't okay. So then Rachel is her name, came out to check us out at home. And I mean, by that point, like I couldn't even breathe when she latched. It was
Oh.
so, especially on the left side, it was so painful.
Mm,
And so she basically said, she's super, super practical person. She basically said, like, look, like you're in really rough shape. Why don't you start pumping? She definitely identified, she's like, I'm not supposed to diagnose a tie, but I definitely think that that's what's going on, a lip tie and a tongue tie. And so she gave us the information for a pediatric dentist and said, like, let's go get those ties released, and then in the meantime pump. And then if you feel like you're healing up a little bit and you want to try latching, like gently gently do that.
mhm,
um and then hopefully that will be in better shape once the ties get released.
mhm.
um which, and in the meantime, I did have to supplement because I was still, I had been pumping, but I hadn't been pumping like a ton, and
Mm.
I hadn't been getting enough to feed her, solely breast milk. Yeah.
So this is what days are you on
This
by the
is
time you're
probably
pumping?
like a week out, basically,
Okay.
because I was just really wrapped up with the blood
Uh-huh.
pressure problem.
Right, yes. And so did you at that time receive any counseling on pumping, or was it
Um,
again like just you were expected to know?
yeah, so the lactation consultant that I saw at home gave me a
Mhm.
ton of info about
Right.
pumping, and
Okay.
basically like the schedule of how often you have to pump, which is way more than you think you have to pump, and
Yeah.
a bunch of supplements that were pretty effective. Crazy names. I wish I can't remember what they were off the top of my head,
That's
but
okay. Yeah.
um yeah, so she kind of hooked me up and got me started, and then we did eventually. Again, it took me longer than it probably should have because I was really just kind of a mess at that point, but
Yeah.
I think it was another, like, week or 2 before we saw the pediatric dentist,
Mhm.
and she actually said that this was, like, the worst lip tie she had ever dealt with.
Oh,
She
wow.
had,
Mhm.
like, all it was, like, all the way across the underneath her lip. It wasn't
Mm,
just, like, in the one spot. It, like, went all the way across. So
mhm.
she had to be lasered, like, twice, and
Mm,
they did the tongue as well.
yeah.
So yeah, so that was that was an interesting experience.
Yeah.
And we went home with all of the exercises that they give you to do, and I was still trying to do the triple feed situation.
Yeah, so
So
describe triple feeding.
so basically nursing and then pumping and then feeding the pumped milk.
Right, and it's
Um
called triple feeding because basically the person having to do the nursing, the pumping, and the
yeah,
feeding is on triple duty, unless you happen to have another person around who can at
who can
least
do
feed
the
up.
bottle. Yeah.
Right,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah, and and then also the exercises for the
right.
ties in
Not to
addition.
mention
So it
that you
was
had a
like,
four-year-old around.
yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it was a lot. It was a lot. And
Mhm.
the baby would not, she never went back to the breast. So
Mm,
she latched one more time, and that was it. She just, I think, got used to the bottle, maybe. I'm not sure, maybe
mm,
in the meantime. Cuz by that point, I mean, it had potentially was like 3 weeks of bottle feeding
mhm,
before we did the tie release.
mm.
So
And did
it
you
was
ever
it was
have
a
that
while.
IBCLC back out to try to help, or by that
Yes.
time?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. She came out a few times once, and then once she was sick and she sent somebody else, and she was wonderful as well. But the baby was
Just
just not having it. She
babies
would
have their own agendas sometimes.
They
Yeah,
do. They
yeah.
do. We call her my central child. She's like the barometer of the house. We all rise and fall with Audrey's moods, and that was her from the very beginning. So
Uh-huh. Yeah.
So that was scary. So
Yeah.
I wound up pumping exclusively for, about 2 months,
Okay.
and I did get to a point where at least most of her intake was breast milk. Not I don't think it was ever all breast milk, but I think I got pretty close,
Mhm.
and then just kind of, it's hard to keep up as their demand goes
Mm,
up. It's hard to keep up the milk production with just the pump.
mhm.
Somebody who ran a mom's group I was in very kind, oh, this is the person we know in common, I think,
Yes.
very
Uh-huh.
kindly loaned me that pump that you can walk around with. It's got like a little holster for the battery
Mhm.
pack.
Mhm.
So I did that. I pumped in the car. I got very good at pumping while driving, which is probably not officially recommended, but that was, I got really good at doing that kind of thing. Just lots of little workarounds to try and get in every possible pumping session I could, but it was just impossible to keep up with her increasing demand, right? And I had a 4-year-old, and then I had, this little baby who was like I mean, my kids move early. So she actually started crawling around 4 months. She's like
Oh, wow. Yeah.
very, very active children. So I was
Mhm.
feeling like I was kind of missing out on some of that stuff because I was like tied to the couch and the pump and
Mhm.
so stressed out about how much I was making. So I eventually decided to let it go. And that was
Mhm.
probably around 2 months.
And how did you have to wean off the pump? How did you do that?
Yeah,
So
I
that you did not
basically
burn out
I sort of tapered it down. I wound up having like a really crazy week that particular week. Like I was just really, really busy. It was my sister's baby shower, stuff like that. So I was kind of running around. So I tried to stretch in between,
Mhm.
sessions like as long as possible. And then when it got like really uncomfortable, then I would pump like just enough to have a little bit of relief. It didn't
Mhm.
take that long. I think by that point my supply wasn't as robust as it needed to be anyway. So it was probably a few days of just kind of stretching it out as much as possible.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. And so so you had an experience of mostly formula feeding and then an experience of pumping for um a couple of months, which is no easy task. That is
Not
so
fun
hard.
for anyone. Yeah.
Right. Um and then what were your feelings at the end of those once you finally decided, I'm going to this is too much. I'm going
Yeah.
to end this. How are you feeling at the
It
end of
was
that?
really hard. It was
Mhm.
really hard, honestly. I mean, even though I felt like I had done everything I possibly could have, I
Mhm.
just, it was really hard to let go of the idea that this was going to happen, even though it had
Mm.
been so long since she had latched at all.
Yeah.
And then, I think it was kind of a consolation like, okay, well, at least if we're not nursing, I'm still getting her my milk and the antibodies and everything. I felt like, okay, well, this is like a good second best, right? And then when I
Mhm.
was letting it go, I felt guilty that she wasn't going to be getting my milk anymore, and even though I had a perfectly healthy formula baby before that, but
Mhm. Yeah.
I felt like I was kind of letting her down. But I think I had started to really recognize that like my mental health could not sustain
Mhm.
the pumping anymore.
Mhm.
So it was hard, and I was also surprised too, like the hormonal shift with stopping pumping. I
Mm.
guess because it wasn't an issue with my first, because we never really got established. It didn't occur to me that I would have this like wave of hormone changes as I stopped
Mm.
pumping. So that was kind of
Mhm.
wacky too.
Yeah, what was that like?
Yeah, I mean, I got like very emotional, and
Mm.
I felt pretty depressed, honestly,
Mhm.
but
Mhm.
not for very long. And it was sort of like this is weird. I don't really think that I feel like this, but it was definitely
Mhm.
like a hormone thing.
Yeah. Wow. Wow, so 2 very different experiences, 2 very different birth
Yes.
experiences. And then you have a third.
And then I had a third. Yeah,
Yeah.
so
So what were you thinking about as you were pregnant? So it's a 2-year difference between your
between
middle
the
and
middle and the third, yeah, just
okay.
about 2 years. Yep.
Mhm. So
Yeah,
what were
and
you
I
thinking
mean, it's
about then?
funny, I was really torn. I felt like, number 1, I had technically been cleared for a VBAC, but I wasn't sure if I wanted to do that again. I had a very hard time dealing with the my second birth, and I was just, like, very concerned that if I tried for a VBAC and it didn't happen, that I was not gonna be in a good place. Like, I really felt like if it went
You mean
awry as the
emotionally and psychologically.
yeah,
It's really
I
hard to
thought I would
recover.
lose my
Yeah,
mind if I
yeah,
tried for
yeah,
a VBAC and didn't get it after that second birth
right.
experience that was so
Yeah.
terrible. So,
Mhm.
I decided not to go for the VBAC just in the interest
Mhm.
of, like, preserving my
Yeah.
sanity. So,
Mhm.
we had a planned C-section, and I also had been very conflicted about whether or not I was gonna try to nurse again because, again, like,
Yeah.
I was so upset, and I was so disappointed, and the pumping thing, it's almost like, you kind of you prepare a little bit and you kind of do everything you think you can do, and then you start nursing and like one thing it doesn't go quite well, so you think, okay, well, I'm just going to try this one other thing, and you try the other
Right.
thing and that doesn't do it, so then you try something else, and it's like every time it was like, oh, I'm just going to try this one last thing, this one last
Right.
thing might do it, and then it's 2 months later and you're pumping every 2 hours, it's just
Right.
completely
Yeah.
crazy. So I just felt like if I tried to nurse again and it didn't go well, I didn't want to be exclusively pumping again forever.
Mm.
So
Mhm.
my concern was that if I that I wouldn't be able to recognize that that's what I was setting myself up for, basically. Like I would start and it might not go well and I think, well, I can just do this one other thing, and then you're in the cycle again.
Right.
So I
Mhm.
almost didn't even try nursing again this time.
Mm.
But then when I decided not to do the VBAC, I thought, okay, like I'm compromising on that. So if I'm going to just go for the planned C-section, then I am going to plan to nurse and hope that that goes better this time.
Yeah.
Um so that's what we did. We had a planned C-section. It went exactly, as I expected it to. Um, I guess the only thing that was a little funky is that, well, pretty funky actually. This was not great. I had gestational diabetes with my third that I had
Oh,
never had with
yeah.
the other two, and it
Mhm.
was totally unmanaged. It like literally, if any carbs at all entered my body, even with insulin, my blood sugar went nuts. So when
Oh,
she was
man.
born, she had dangerously low blood sugar because I hadn't,
Mm.
because she had been used to getting
Right.
so much glucose when she was inside of me. So, yeah, so as soon as she was born, her sugar tanked. So we did skin to skin for like a hot second, basically, like right after my C-section. But then
Mhm.
she had to go off to the special care unit to get. She had to be supplemented with glucose, and they were giving her, I forget what it was called, but it was a formula that was like a very specific sugar content, basically,
Yeah.
to get her
Mhm.
back up. But so that was really hard, but on the other hand, I had really learned a lot through the other two experiences. So like the second they got me in my room, I requested a hospital pump
Mhm.
and I started pumping every 2 hours and just to get my supply in.
Yeah.
And that went really well. So that was like a huge relief. So basically, by the time we left, we were able to get a prescription for donor milk because I wasn't quite up to speed yet, but she latched great. I had every human who came in my room check her check her latch so that I
Uh-huh.
could and she latched really well. She was doing really well. My supply seemed pretty, it was like on its way in basically. And so we had the donor milk too, but we didn't need very much of it. So that was really good. And then at home, same thing. I did have the lactation consultant back out to the house to check the latch again, just because I mean I'm paranoid at this point. I think everybody's got a tie. So she helped me out just with confidence and that kind of thing. But really everything looked pretty good. So I was like nursing happily, still working on my supply. And then what happened was she started dropping percentiles like
Mhm,
crazy. Like she was
mhm,
she was almost an 11-pound baby. She was huge because she was so fat from the diabetes. So
mhm,
she was like 10 pounds, 11 ounces, I think. She was huge.
mhm.
Um, and so she was, very high up on the percentiles, like 99th percentile. And of course, as you would expect, she started to lose some weight because a lot of that was kind of artificial, right? But then
Right.
she started to lose like a lot of weight. And so
Mm.
I did a lot of weighted feeds at the doctor's office, her pediatrician's office. I did weighted feeds at home with my lactation consultant.
Now,
And
describe a weighted feed for
Oh,
us.
yeah, so basically you weigh the baby before they
Mhm,
nurse, and then
mhm,
you nurse, and then you weigh the baby after to see how
mhm.
much milk they took in.
And what were you discovering from all these weighted feeds?
So she was transferring it was, like, a little bit suboptimal, like, a little bit. I wanna say
Uh-huh.
it was, like, actually, I can't even remember how many ounces it was, but basically everyone was like, "That's pretty good. It's not
But
awesome, but it's,
not
like,
enough
pretty
to be
good."
losing tons of weight.
Right, right.
Okay.
And yeah, so I mean, I think when that stuff is happening, sometimes our pediatrician is wonderful, so I didn't feel this from her at all. But I think sometimes you start to look a little bit sideways, like, are they really feeding this baby? I mean, she got down to the third percentile,
Oh,
so
wow.
she was diagnosed with failure to thrive, which was like just the worst term ever,
I
basically.
know. Yeah.
Why do we call it that? Can't we call it something else?
I know.
Um, but we saw a pediatric GI, and basically that it turns out she had an intolerance to dairy and to soy. So I initially cut
Um,
dairy, and then she continued to lose weight, so then I cut soy, and that's when we saw like a big turnaround. So she started to
Wow.
catch back up, and we did eventually, well, we did for just a month or two have to supplement with, or not even really supplement. What did they call it? They called it fortifying. So
Mhm.
I would feed the baby, I would nurse the baby, then I would pump, and then the pumped milk, we would add a teensy bit, like 1 teaspoon of this formula called Elecare, which is like basically like a
High calorie.
hypoallergenic.
Yeah.
Um, and so we would just add 1 teaspoon to 1 ounce of milk.
Okay.
And then I would give that to her. And that seemed to be just like the little push that she needed to catch back up with herself. So we only did
Wow.
that for a couple of months. Um, and she was, just nursed otherwise, and she caught right back up. So it was I was dairy free and soy free for probably about a year, almost a year. So
Wow.
that
And
was.
that's hard to do because there's lots of hidden dairy and soy.
Yeah, soy, it turns out, is in like everything you eat. It's wild. I mean, I guess I lucked out a bit because we cook a lot.
Mhm.
So I didn't have to worry as much about hidden ingredients as you would if you buy like a lot of prepared food or a lot of frozen food or even eating out. The other thing was, we went into lockdown 2 weeks after
Oh,
we had
yeah.
her. So all
Oh,
of
yeah.
this was happening in
Right.
quarantine.
Right.
Um, so, it's, I guess, kind of a good thing because it's not like we were missing going out to restaurants or anything like that where you might
Yeah.
not be able to identify allergens as easily. So the timing was not the worst given the state of things at that point. So we kind of lucked out there, I guess. But and also just being in quarantine, I mean, you can just feed that baby all day. That's
Right.
you
That's all
know
there is to do. Right.
yeah, yeah. So, like, all of this stuff that might have been distracting, or I know was distracting with my second, getting my oldest to school and her after
Mhm.
school activities and stuff like that. I didn't have to do any of that. So I really just sat on my couch and fed the baby, which was really my job. So,
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
um,
You didn't have all the extra stuff
yeah,
to
yeah.
get in the
And
way.
she's still nursing. So she's 2 this week, and she is
Uh-huh.
a boob addict. She
Oh, wow.
she would nurse 24/7 if I let that happen.
And so does she still have the dairy and soy intolerance, or were
No,
you
she
able?
so basically she grew out of it. They had me
Okay.
trial they did not have me do like the full ladder. There's this whole like very regimented way of introducing allergens basically that um a lot of doctors or even just like Facebook support groups and stuff like that recommend. Basically, by that point, we were pretty confident that she was doing well. So even if she had a reaction, they just weren't that worried about it at that point because she was about a
Mhm.
year. So,
Mm.
um, yeah, so I basically just like trialed some yogurt for her for a couple days and made sure nothing completely wacky happened, and it didn't. She did great. I didn't notice a change at all.
Mhm.
Yeah,
And
which
that's
was
the
great. I
difference
love cheese. It
between
was a big
an
sacrifice to
allergy.
give up the cheese.
I'm sure, yes, it is a big sacrifice. But that is the difference between an allergy and an
Intolerance,
intolerance.
exactly.
Yeah.
Yep.
So, were there other signs of, besides the weight? I mean, that huge drop in weight is a huge sign, but were
Yeah.
there other signs that she was having? Were there bloody stools or anything else like that that,
She didn't have
um
she only had bloody stools, like, once or twice. What she had was a ton of mucus in her diapers,
okay,
tons, which I
okay.
actually didn't realize that's what it was, and then
Uh-huh.
my doctor asked me, and I was like, "I don't know, I don't think so," and then I went home and I Googled it and was like, "Oh, yeah, that's mucus," and
Yeah.
it's funny too because it turns out so my second, um, even after I stopped pumping and she was just on formula, when I started her, I worked at a daycare at that point, a couple days a week, and I brought her in so she could be in the baby room while I was working, and she would go through like 10 bottles in a day, 10 like 8-ounce bottles of formula in a
Wow.
day. And she would poop every single time. And now I know from my third that she
Yes.
probably had the same thing going on because it looked just the
Right.
same. And so
Right.
we
Yeah.
didn't know 'cause she was a formula baby. So like, she
Right.
seems hungry, just give her another bottle, right? So we just didn't
Right.
know any better, but I think that probably they both had that issue, and we just only caught it with the third because I was nursing.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting. So
Yep.
I wanna go back a little bit. You were in the middle of your story, so I didn't wanna interrupt, but you did receive donor milk, and I would love to know what that process was like.
Yeah. Yeah. So in the hospital, they were giving her donor milk when I was still pumping and trying to get my supply in.
Mhm.
And then when we were being discharged, we got a prescription for it. So we basically could go, I think I had to call, and it was the like Northeast Milk Bank or something like that.
Mhm.
But
Yeah.
basically, I had to fax the prescription over or like email it or whatever. And then I had to call and ask for the amount that we needed. And they would deliver it via, some crazy shipping method packed in dry ice.
Oh, wow.
Uh-huh,
Where
these,
did it
like,
get
little
shipped to
milk
you?
bottles, basically. We
Oh,
only did it maybe twice.
okay.
Yep. And
Yeah.
then actually so then
And you're
after I had to cut dairy and soy, I had a whole stash from pumping. I had probably not a ton
right.
for somebody else, but for me, it was a really big deal because I had never gotten ahead with my other kids, so I had a bunch in the freezer, and I wound up donating through Human Milk for Human Babies, the Facebook
Oh,
group.
right. Uh-huh.
Locally. So I donated, I don't know, probably like 200 ounces by the time all was said and done to just different people who needed the milk and couldn't get the prescription that we had. I didn't qualify for donating through the milk bank itself because they had restrictions on medication and alcohol
Uh-huh.
and stuff like that. And caffeine even, I think. So
Yes.
I had
Yeah.
to go through the Facebook group instead, but that worked out perfectly.
That's great. So you connected with, like, one person who needed milk, or you distributed it to several
I
people?
did it twice. So I
Okay.
think it just went to two different people. And I basically
That's
just put
amazing.
they have like a pretty well-oiled machine kind of method for how you announce that you have milk or announce that you're looking for milk basically. And
Yeah.
so I put it up there and on the Facebook group, and then people could IM you and let you know what their situation was and what they needed. Some people, I don't know, some people would like send pictures of the baby or give you like a whole backstory, and I felt really bad about that. It felt like people were like, I don't know,
Hmm.
competing for the milk, and I just felt kind of grossed out that people have to do that to begin with, but
Yeah.
I just gave it to the
Yeah.
first person that popped up. And
Yeah.
I think the first person who took it was that was my milk from before I had cut dairy and soy. So that was
Hmm.
somebody whose babies didn't have an intolerance. But then the second person, I wound up with just more from pumping than I needed. So I wound up donating that to somebody who had, their kid
To
was
have
not able to
intolerance.
tolerate the
Yeah,
dairy
that's
and the
great.
soy. So she
Yeah.
was able to take that, which is hard to get a hold of. So
Right. Yeah,
um,
for sure. Oh, that's amazing.
yeah.
So did you end up going back to work at all after the third?
No, well, not really. So I basically, when my second was about 6 months old, I took a job running a local arts nonprofit where I
Mm,
was basically the only staff member. So I did a lot of my work at home anyway. So I had been working from home with my second for like 2 years at that point.
mhm,
Because of I intended to go back to work because I was trying to juggle, having the kids at home and working from home, and I intended to go back to work, but then the pandemic happened, and so none of our programs were able to run.
mm,
So I worked a couple hours a week from home, and then eventually wound up laying myself off because I was
yeah,
just draining the resources of the organization. And I think things are starting to open back up, and I think their programming is likely to open back up. But at this point, I'm a stay-at-home mom for the time being. I do some freelance work and that kind of thing, so I work from home mostly.
yeah,
Yeah.
great. So I always ask, not because I don't think working to care for your children is work,
Yeah.
but because having to navigate pumping and providing milk away
Yeah.
from your babies is a whole nother story. So
Yes.
I always like to
Yeah, I
hear it.
have not had to deal with that, thank goodness.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, and so now your two-year-old is still going strong.
Yeah.
Does she still nurse through the night as well?
She does. Yes.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
Yeah.
She was we're I mean, I know you're not supposed to do this, but we tend to co-sleep anyway because it's just the thing that has worked best for each one of my kids at different points in their life. So she
Yeah.
is in our bed. I was for a while nursing and then putting her down in her crib, and she would fall asleep in there and then wake up in the middle of the night and end up in bed with me at that point.
Mhm.
But
Mhm.
she came down with just a cold. I mean, it's just like a little bug, like a virus or something.
Mhm.
Probably like 2 or 3 months ago, and because she wasn't feeling well, she wanted to be with mama, so she was in bed with us, and she's never gone back in. So she's
Yeah.
now in my
Yeah.
bed full time, which means that she wants to nurse as long as I'm in bed.
Yes.
Yep.
And how's that going for you? Are you feeling good about that?
It's
Are
okay. I
you
mean, I'd like to sleep more for sure.
Uh-huh.
We've gotten in a pretty good routine where I like barely wake up anyway, and she's old
Yeah.
enough where like she can take my boob out of my sleep bra herself.
Yes.
So
Right.
I'm not
Yes.
really
They they
necessary most of the
they get
time.
very resourceful. Right.
Yeah.
They
Yeah.
pretty independent.
Yes. Yeah. So I mean,
Yeah.
I'd like to sleep more possibly, but
Mhm.
she tends to wake up around like 4 a.m. and really want to nurse until we like get out of bed.
Mhm.
I'd love for that to be like 6 a.m. instead of 4 at this point,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
uh
But at
it's
least you
all
can
right.
lay there in bed a little longer and not
Exactly.
actually have to
Exactly.
get out of bed. Yeah. I
Yeah.
keep telling my husband we'll sleep when we're old.
Yeah. Yeah. I hope so.
I know, we might not. Yeah. We might just miss that train.
I know.
Yeah. So, as we're wrapping up, I would love to know what was the worst advice you were given
Oh
throughout
boy.
all of your breastfeeding
I feel like
journeys?
I got so much terrible advice. Um, well, I mean, I almost feel like the worst thing was like the lack of advice that I got,
Mm,
especially with my first. I mean,
mhm.
1 week postpartum with mastitis. So, like, the
Right.
fact that nobody even mentioned, "Hey, maybe there's a latch problem," is just kind of
Mhm.
wacky. They also had me taking fenugreek, which I then learned later is maybe not the best thing to be taking, so that
Mhm.
wasn't awesome either.
Right. Yeah.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. And then what would you say was the best advice you were given throughout your years of feeding babies?
I so after the experience with my first, this friend of mine who worked at the birth center said you gotta see an IBCLC. So you have to have an independent person
Mhm.
come to
Mhm.
you. Don't
Mhm.
don't rely on the hospital because they have policies they're bound to and they have their own red tape and it's a completely different mindset sometimes. That
Mhm.
was like the best advice is like getting the right help and getting it early. um and yeah, she was right, so that's that's I have called on my lactation consultant many times and that's been the best.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
great. I meant to ask too, did you get insurance coverage for those visits from your IBCLC?
They were very tricky about the whole thing, but
Mhm.
I think I got partial reimbursement
Okay.
for
Yeah,
some of
I
it, and
really
then
wish
I
it was
think I
better
had to
covered.
pay out of pocket for the tie release, but it wasn't that much.
Okay.
Yep. Like
Yeah.
maybe like 350 or something like that.
Okay. Yeah, so for it's I really feel for people who don't have the resources to get the help,
I
and
know, I
yeah,
know. And also, I mean, I think in other times you could probably kind of find a workaround and go to somebody's breastfeeding support group or,
right.
like the
Yes.
moms group
Yes.
where they have somebody
Mhm.
there who can
Right.
do a weighted feed for you and stuff. But of course, with my third, that wasn't an option. And I
That
think
wasn't
that's
an
still not
option.
an option for many
Yes.
people.
Right. Right, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, are there any resources that really helped you to either meet your goals or to be okay with changing your goals that you would like to share that you feel like would
That
help
is a
other
really good
people?
question. I guess, I mean, the power of the moms group on Facebook cannot be overstated. Like this was dairy and soy specific, but I joined a
Mm,
Facebook group called Dairy Free and Soy Free Best Breastfeeding. Which is actually it's not like the biggest one on Facebook, but I found it to be the most supportive and like the most science based. There's a
mm,
lot of really bad information out there.
yeah.
So like this, I found a really supportive Facebook group that if you're dealing with having to cut any of the big allergens like that was super helpful in terms of people just sharing support but also sharing recipes or things they've found at chain restaurants that are safe or
Oh, great.
substitutions that have worked for them. We wound up throwing a dairy free, soy free, and also gluten free Thanksgiving because we held it with our neighbor who is celiac.
Oh,
And the Facebook group was just full of stuff that you wouldn't have even known. So it was totally manageable once we found like the right support.
oh, that's so great. And what's
Yeah.
that Facebook group called again? Say it
Let
one
me
more
pull
time.
it up. Actually, I want to double check that I get it right because, as I said, there's a couple online that are bigger and they are not super helpful. Let me
Okay.
grab.
I can also share it. If you want to share it with me, I can
Oh,
share it
yeah.
in show notes um, once I publish the podcast.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, well,
Um,
awesome.
yeah,
Thank you so
dairy
much.
and soy free breastfeeding support is the
Dairy
name of
and
the group.
soy-free breastfeeding support.
Yep.
Awesome. Yeah. Thank you so much for coming
Thank you
on
so
and
much.
sharing your stories. You went through so much in your births and in your baby feeding experiences, and I feel honored that you wanted to share those stories. I think so
Oh,
many
thank
people
you.
will take comfort and relate to your stories. And I thank you so much for sharing the space with me this morning to do that.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. I love chatting about this stuff.
Yes, me too. All right. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you so much for listening to the Milk Making Minutes. I hope you found connection and feel supported wherever you are in your baby feeding journey. The views expressed in each interview are deeply personal and sacred, and I'm so grateful to each person who was generous enough to share their story. It is also true that those views are solely theirs and do not necessarily reflect my opinion or advice as a lactation supporter, and this podcast does not qualify as medical advice. If you are struggling to feed your baby, please seek out the support of a local IBCLC.